It's the Turducken of video games on Super NES Works, episode 19. It's Independence Day here in the US of A, and what classic video game could be more American to look back on than the sports game that kicked off the biggest sports franchise in America? John Madden Football is the Super NES adaptation of a game that launched a dynasty. For that matter, what sport could be more American than football? It's a game that we stole from someone else and crammed with violence, just like the US itself. But I kid. I admit that American football doesn't do much for me, but that's just because I have trouble maintaining interest in any sport, except curling. It's so weird and I love that. Despite my relationship with the Madden franchise being very much like your average vampire's relationship with garlic, I can still appreciate the historic import of the original John Madden Football. It begat Madden NFL, one of the most consistently best-selling video game series every year for the past 2 decades running. Deservedly so, really. There's so much more depth and freedom of play to this game than the other football sims of its time that it truly feels like a genuine generational leap in game design from something like Tecmo Super Bowl. John Madden Football for Super NES was an adaptation of the 1990 Sega Genesis game, which in turn converted a 1987 PC title to consoles. Still, despite its relative age at the time of its Super NES debut, Madden absolutely put other football sims to shame with its enormous depth of design. While this adaptation isn't the best regarded version of the original Madden, it's nevertheless miles ahead of its contemporary competition. John Madden, of course, was one of the most successful National Football League coaches of all time and had moved on to providing color commentary for televised games at this point, and this video game reflects his expertise and strategic understanding of the sport. Madden on Super NES allows you to jump in and play as breezily or as in-depth as you like. It offers everything from a quick sudden death mode where the first team to score wins immediately, to a full in-depth season of games, each consisting of 4 15-minute quarters, complete with timeouts and formation changes. At this point, publisher Electronic Arts hadn't yet tied the official NFL license to the Madden series, so all the teams and players here feel like bootleg editions of their real-world counterparts. The colors and stadiums seem authentic enough at a glance, but there aren't any proper team or player names, and everything is just a bit off. It gets the point across, though. The roughly dozen or so teams available to play here look pretty close to real, and in any case there's enough variety and depth to the game to feel good enough. Madden really shines in the breadth of its options. Unlike, say, Konami's NFL Football for Game Boy, which included a manual that included a few play diagrams that did nothing to clarify how the game is meant to be played, Madden comes with a dense booklet that feels almost like a tiny textbook on the sport. There are dozens upon dozens of offensive and defensive formation options here, subdivided into the situations in which you'd need to use them, whether you're right up at the goal line or deep in the opponent's side of the field. It's all a little overwhelming for someone who doesn't follow football, but the manual does a solid job of helping players to pick through their options. Madden also allows players to be as hands-on as they want. You can sit back and let the computer play versus itself as a sort of exhibition mode if you prefer, but for those who like to get their hands dirty, you can also fuss over every single play. Not only does Madden let you set up different formations, it also gives you the ability to influence granular actions on the field. Although the simulation-style play of Madden requires team-based sports like this to be largely automated, compared to more arcade action-type football games such as NFL BLITZ, you still have the ability to tweak your player's performance on the field each play. Madden includes optional button commands with which you can fine-tune a receiver's actions, or attempt to, say, break a tackle. Each of these options comes with a certain risk-reward mix. Tapping the reception button will cause a receiver to raise his arms to better catch the ball than he would by default, but if you whiff the timing, you're guaranteed to miss. Likewise, if you attempt too strenuously to break a tackle, you'll definitely fumble the ball and give up a turnover. Field conditions matter too. Your players will experience different degrees of hardship and fatigue depending on whether you play on grass or AstroTurf, or in clear, rainy, or snowy conditions. There's a lot of game here for either 1, 2, or 0 players, and it's not hard to see why John Madden Football became the industry's gold standard, especially once EA grabbed that all-important league license a few years later. Like I said though, the Super NES port isn't the most highly regarded Madden conversion of the time. This adaptation was produced by Park Place Productions, and despite shipping a year after the Genesis game on ostensibly more powerful hardware, it feels a little lacking. Besides moving more slowly, Madden on Super NES sounds muddier. The ambient crowd noise in particular has an eerie feel to it. It makes the entire game a little bit disturbing. It lacks the Genesis's flashy bookend visuals too. And while the game does appear to make use of Mode 7 scaling for the field graphic, it would be hard to say that it looks any more sophisticated or immersive than the simpler visual technique used in the Genesis version. Maybe it doesn't matter. This wasn't the most important version of John Madden Football in any case. Historically speaking, that was the Genesis version. This game originally debuted on Apple II and Commodore 64, but it was the Genesis port that really exploded. That release was one of those rising tides that lifted all ships. It improved not only the Madden series' standing, and EA with it, but it also helped turn around Sega's fortunes in the US. After all, Sega hadn't even released its original console, the SG-1000, in the West. And that system's follow-up, the Master System, was a distant also ran to the NES everywhere in the world except in Brazil and certain parts of Europe. The Genesis's Japanese counterpart, the Mega Drive, continued Sega's second banana status in that market. But the system quickly eclipsed Nintendo's popularity in America, forcing the Super NES to spend years trying to make up the difference. And John Madden Football played a huge part in that. EA also used Madden to play a reckless form of chicken with Sega. The publisher figured out how to circumvent Genesis's hardware lockout, which was designed to prevent third parties from publishing their own software without a license. EA used this knowledge to barter for better licensing terms with Sega. While Sega was reluctant to bargain with terrorists and grant EA the kind of sweet deal they demanded, they also realized that it would be better in the long run if they kept EA under license, even at a reduced royalty rate. After all, if EA went independent, what was stopping them from sharing their lockout circumvention trick with everyone else? But EA's presence on Genesis turned the system into a powerhouse, as the publisher cranked out one great sports game after another. All those dated hockey and football carts that clog flea market Genesis bins today are relics of the console's dominance in the US market during the 90s. As for John Madden Football itself, its legacy in turn has a lot to do with EA founder Trip Hawkins' passion for the sport. According to Polygon's History of Fun podcast, Hawkins had been attempting to gamify American football for about a decade by the time John Madden Football debuted. Initially, he sought to turn it into a sort of board and card game similar to a tabletop RPG. This convoluted plan didn't really pan out, but once Hawkins left Apple Computer to establish EA, he continued plugging away at his football vision. It took years of development and countless false starts, but eventually Hawkins' enthusiasm resulted in John Madden Football. So really, it's not particularly accurate to say the video game reflects Madden's coaching acumen. He was an also-ran pick for the game's mascot and wasn't even entirely sold on the whole venture at first. No, John Madden Football might more accurately be called Trip Hawkins Football. Not that you'd really want someone named Trip representing a game about running, of course. In any case, the Super NES version, while less impressive than its Genesis counterpart, is another point in a continuing legacy that resulted from one man's fixation on the sport back in the 70s. As with so many sports games of the 16-bit era, there's very little reason to return to this crusty relic of a video game. Still, it's not hard to appreciate what John Madden Football represents in video game history and how impressive a football sim it would have been back in 1991, even if, it's not really football. Next on Super NES Works, we strain the limits of the word radical.